In the winter camps of 1942, German troops shared cigarettes and jokes about the Americans' antique weapons. A Browning .30 caliber to them. It was a relic of another war, heavy, outdated, and far less impressive than the sleek MG-34s and MG-42s they proudly manned around the campfires. They boasted that the American infantryman was burdened with clumsy toys, weapons that could never stand against the steel precision of the Reich. But laughter dies quickly when it collides with reality. The first shocking encounters came in North Africa. Dust storms whipped through the dunes, trucks groaned with supplies, and the desert sun turned rifles into burning rods. German squads advancing against American lines expected scattered resistance, yet what greeted them was the steady, unrelenting bark of the Browning .30 cal. Its metallic rhythm cut through the air, not with the frenzy of the MG-42's buzzsaw, but with a brutal steadiness. A voice that said, "I will not stop until you do." Imagine the scene: a machine dug into a low ridge, its water jacket glistening in the sun, crews feeding it, belts that seemed to stretch on forever. Each round cracked through the air, kicking up dust and tearing through helmets. German soldiers dove for cover, their mocking smiles replaced by curses and hurried prayers. Those who had laughed in the barracks found their ears ringing with a new, unforgettable sound, the hammering pulse of American firepower. Factories thousands of miles away had prepared this moment, while German engineers obsessed over innovation and complexity. American industry chose simplicity and endurance. The .30 cal could be fired for hours, cooled with water, repaired in the field with a wrench and grit. Soldiers learned to trust it not as a fragile tool, but as a companion that would never betray them, no matter how fierce the fight. Anecdotes filtered back through captured diaries. A young German corporal, writing in disbelief after Kasserine, described seeing his comrades shredded while he had scoffed at the clunky pipe gun. In prison camps later, whispers spread among prisoners about the weapon's uncanny persistence, the American firehammer, some called it, recalling the sound that refused to fade even after dreams. And so, what began as a sneer became a symbol of dread. The Browning .30 caliber had announced itself to the world, not with fanfare, but with relentless, merciless rhythm. In dimly lit workshops across the United States, the weapon the Germans mocked was being born again and again, by the thousands. It did not begin with a thunderclap on the battlefield, but with the hiss of welding torches, the clatter of rivet guns, and the smell of hot oil. Here, on assembly lines stretching longer than football fields, men and women in coveralls transformed raw steel into the Browning M1917 and its air-cooled cousin, the M1919, the backbone of American firepower. The weapon was not glamorous. It lacked the sleek menace of the MG-42, whose terrifying rate of fire Germans loved to flaunt. But the Browning was something far more dangerous, reliable. Designed by John Browning decades earlier, perfected through the mud of World War I. It had been tested in snow, in deserts, in swamps. Soldiers could drop it in sand, clean it with kerosene, and trust it to roar again. It was not just a machine gun, it was a promise. Every bolt, every spring, every barrel came from a place that never slept, in Hartford, Detroit, and Chicago. Factories that once produced cars or farm equipment now ran on war schedules, their windows glowing deep into the night. At shift changes, women with scarves tied around their hair marched past soot-covered men, trading places at the machines, in cafeterias. Workers shared stories of brothers already overseas, of telegrams that never came, of hopes pinned to the guns, rolling off the line. A machinist's diary in 1943 recalls how she and her coworkers began stamping small initials inside the crates to send a piece of ourselves to the boys. She wrote, "It was gossip, but it mattered." Soldiers later swore they found those initials scratched in the wood, a reminder that someone back home had built this weapon with both hands and heart. What truly set the Browning apart was its endurance, where German weapons could overheat and seize in long battles. The water-cooled M1917 could sustain fire for nearly uninterrupted streams, the hiss of boiling water rising as steam from the barrel's jacket. Infantry units discovered they could rely on it as a defensive anchor, a weapon that held the line when everything else faltered. In tests, it fired 20,000 rounds in a single run without failure. German troops never believed those numbers until they saw them play out in blood. And yet, while factories produced, soldiers trained at American bases. Recruits were introduced to the Browning not with reverence, but with sweat and curses. Its tripod was heavy, its barrel cumbersome, its weight punishing during long marches. Many grumbled at carrying it until the first time they fired, the moment the trigger was pressed, and the long rhythmic bursts carved through the air. Complaints turned to awe. A weapon that had seemed a burden became a shield, a sword, a heartbeat of survival. By 1943, tens of thousands of Brownings had already crossed the Atlantic, crated in ships, unloaded onto docks, hauled on trains. They spread into every theater of war. To the Germans, the Browning was still an American relic. To the Allies, it was the iron metronome of a new war, steady, patient, unstoppable, and soon, that rhythm would echo across the deserts of North Africa. The desert was supposed to be a playground for the German Afrika Korps. They had rolled across Libya and Tunisia with confidence, their MG-34s and MG-42s rattling like mechanical buzzsaws, their panzers leading armored thrusts under Rommel's command against poorly trained Americans. Many Germans believed the outcome was already decided. They sneered at the Browning 30 caliber, calling it an old iron pipe. But in February 1943 at Kasserine Pass, the desert air told another story. The ridges surrounding the pass were scarred with foxholes and sandbagged positions. American gunners crouched low, sweat dripping into their eyes, feeding long belts of ammunition into the waiting Brownings. The sun scorched metal so hot it burned through gloves, but the crews pressed on. Then the moment came, columns of German infantry advancing, their footsteps crunching over the gravel of North Africa. What followed was not the high-pitched scream of the MG-42. Instead, it was a pounding rhythm, deep and methodical, like a giant hammer striking the earth over and over. The 30 caliber spoke. Round after round tore through the air, cutting into the advance. German soldiers dropped where they stood, others diving for cover behind rocks and dunes. The sound was unlike anything they had trained for, not a staccato burst that came and went, but a steady stream, an iron rain that simply did not stop. Prisoners taken after the battle would whisper of the slow thunder that haunted them, admitting, with grudging respect, that they had underestimated it. Anecdotes emerged from both sides. One American gunner wrote in his field notes of watching a German officer freeze mid-charge, struck down before he could raise his pistol. Another recalled how his weapon kept firing even after sandstorms had half buried the tripod. While German weapons jammed in the grit, soldiers joked grimly that the Browning eats sand for breakfast. But beyond the battlefield, the numbers told the tale. During the North African campaign alone, American units expended millions of rounds through the 30 caliber, its barrels glowing red, water jackets hissing with steam, in one 24-hour span. A single gun crew poured out 10,000 rounds without a failure. Engineers back home heard of these feats with quiet pride. The weapon had passed its baptism of fire. And still, there was tragedy. The pass became a graveyard for many Americans too. Their positions overrun when coordination faltered. Their Brownings captured and turned against them. German troops marveled at the weapon they had mocked, sometimes mounting it for their own use. A captured diary from a German sergeant confessed, "The American gunfire's like the devil himself. We use it when we can." The laughter was gone now. In its place grew a respect mixed with fear. As dusk fell over Kasserine, the desert cooled, and smoke drifted lazily across the sand. Survivors from both sides stared at the twisted wrecks of tanks, the rows of fallen men, the belts of spent casings glittering like copper snakes in the fading light. For the Germans, this was only the first of many encounters with a weapon they had once dismissed. The Browning 30 caliber had earned its place not through elegance, but through stubborn, unyielding rhythm. Back home, the war never slept. America's factories had become fortresses of firepower, and inside them, the heartbeat of the Browning 30 caliber never paused. Shift whistles blew at midnight. Locomotives rattled past with boxcars full of steel, and assembly lines stretched further than the eye could follow. While soldiers in North Africa and Sicily trusted their Brownings to hold the line, millions of workers kept feeding the arsenal behind them. Detroit. Once a kingdom of cars, became a kingdom of guns. Henry Ford's plants, once stamping out sedans, now poured out machine gun parts by the ton. Across the Midwest, typewriter companies forged triggers, sewing machine factories shaped springs, and refrigerator plants pressed cooling jackets. Nothing was wasted, nothing was idle. A worker in Cleveland scribbled in his pocket diary, "We drink more coffee than water. The nights run into days. Each gun might mean my boy gets home alive." The scale was staggering. By 1944, tens of thousands of Brownings had rolled off the line, so many that American infantry divisions could be outfitted with multiple guns per platoon, their firepower multiplying with every crate unloaded at the docks. Ammunition belts, linked by hand and machine, stretched for miles if laid end to end. One foreman joked to reporters that if all the belts produced in a single month were unraveled, they could circle the earth twice. It wasn't far from the truth. And yet, for all the machinery, human stories defined the work. Women in bandanas sang songs over the din of the presses. Teenage boys too young for the draft worked night shifts stamping metal. Older men whose sons were overseas pulled double shifts despite aching backs. In the break rooms, gossip filled the air, talk of rationed sugar, of telegrams that made mothers weep, of the hope that the war would end before another Christmas passed. Some workers began tucking small notes into ammunition boxes from Chicago with pride. Built for victory, come home safe. Soldiers later swore they had found them, folded between belts of 30 cal rounds. This was more than production, it was ritual. Every rivet was a prayer, every crate a promise. And the Germans, who mocked American weapons as clumsy, had no idea of the tidal wave building across the ocean. One POW, years later, recalled being transported past an American city at night, watching the horizon lit up as if by dawn. "I thought it was fire," he said, but the guard whispered, "That's the factories." We could not believe a nation could burn so bright. Even in war, the .30 caliber was not just forged of steel, it was forged of sleepless nights, of burned fingers, of whispered songs and weary determination. While the front lines echoed with gunfire, the factories echoed with the rhythm that would never stop until the world itself was changed. Dawn broke over Normandy on June 6, 1944, with a roar that shook the sea itself. Waves of landing craft pushed toward the beaches, their ramps rattling, soldiers clutching rifles slick with spray. Overhead, the sky filled with thunder bombers, fighters, and the endless drone of engines. But on the sand, amid the chaos of surf and wire, another sound would define the day, the rhythmic, pounding voice of the Browning .30 caliber. German defenders had fortified the cliffs with concrete bunkers, machine gun nests, and interlocking fields of fire. Their MG-42s spat death in high-pitched bursts, cutting down wave after wave of Americans. Men fell into the surf, rifles sinking, bodies pulled under. For a moment, it seemed the Reich's laughter would have the last word. But then the Brownings came ashore, carried across the waves on Higgins boats, dragged through the water by soaked crews. The .30 caliber began its reply, propped against seawalls, mounted on tripods in wet sand. The guns opened fire. Their rhythm was slower than the German buzzsaws, but their voice was deeper, heavier, and most importantly, relentless. Burst after burst clawed into the cliffs, pinning German heads down, covering the infantry who crawled forward inch by inch. Anecdotes surfaced later. A sergeant recalled how his Browning's barrel glowed red as he poured fire into a pillbox slit. Refusing to let the enemy lift their heads, another soldier swore he heard German voices shouting, "Das Wasser." Das Wasser as water jackets hissed and steamed, the weapon refusing to fall silent even in the storm of sand and blood. Normandy became the proving ground of American firepower. By day's end, the beaches were littered with twisted wire, shattered helmets, and long trails of spent shell casings. German defenders who had once mocked American weapons now surrendered with trembling hands, their eyes fixed warily on the squat, unassuming Brownings still barking in the distance. One POW whispered, as he was led past, "It does not stop. It never stops." But beyond the horror lay something greater scale. Behind every gun on the beach lay not just a crew of 3 or 4 men, but the weight of factories that had never slept. The sheer number of Brownings meant that even when one jammed or overheated, another was already in position, another already spitting fire, another already covering the charge. The Germans could not comprehend it, the industrial flood that turned the tide of war. One belt at a time. By nightfall, the beaches belonged to the Allies. The Browning .30 caliber, once scorned as a relic, had become the iron pulse of liberation. And here, let me turn to you. Watching now, if you had been on those beaches, crawling through surf and sand under the scream of the MG-42, which weapon would you have trusted with your life, the faster German buzz saw, or the steadier? Unyielding American hammer. Share your thoughts below. Your perspective helps keep this history alive. The battlefields gave way to barbed wire. By 1944, German prisoners of war were arriving in staggering numbers, thousands captured in France, Belgium, and later, Germany itself. They were marched into camps where the rattle of chains was replaced by the rattle of distant trains, where once proud soldiers now stared through fences at a world they could not control. Inside those camps, talk traveled faster than contraband tobacco. The subject was not just defeat, or food, or letters from home. It was the weapon they once mocked, the Browning .30 caliber. Prisoners whispered about it with the tone usually reserved for storms or earthquakes. It does not stop. One man muttered to another, staring at the ground. Others recalled the way water jackets hissed like snakes. Even as the gun spat fire hour after hour, some nicknamed it Das Amerikanische Feuerrohr, the American fire hose. Gossip spread that no matter how much mud or sand clogged it, the gun roared back to life after only a few moments of care. One guard remembered a curious exchange a captured sergeant. Once boastful about the MG-42, fell silent after watching a Browning test fire inside the camp perimeter. His hands shook as he whispered, "We thought it was old, but it is eternal." And while the prisoners wrestled with this grudging respect, their lives inside the wire exposed them to another shock, the sheer abundance behind the weapon. Lunch trays carried bread, meat, and coffee luxuries compared to rations in the Wehrmacht. They watched American workers pass by the camps with lunchboxes bigger than their own field rations. The same workers who built the guns also built a society where food, electricity, and even cigarettes seemed endless. The weapon was terrifying not only because of its fire, but because it symbolized the system that produced it. Letters confiscated from POWs revealed a mixture of fear and envy. One man wrote that he could still hear the rhythm of the gun in his sleep, while another confessed that seeing crates of ammunition stacked higher than a man broke something inside. Their illusions of German superiority, forged in propaganda, were shredded by the reality of American industry and the weapons it sustained. And yet, even here, humanity persisted. Prisoners worked in the fields, saw children laugh beyond the fences, and sometimes watched guards handle Brownings with the same care a farmer gives to a plow. For some, this sparked quiet reflection: could a nation capable of such devastating weapons also be capable of mercy? Here, I want to ask you, the audience, do you think fear is more powerful than respect in shaping how enemies see each other? And if you were a prisoner, hearing every day about the very weapon that once cut down your comrades, how would it change the way you remembered the war? Leave your thoughts below. Your reflections add depth to this story. Numbers do not bleed. Numbers do not scream. Yet sometimes, numbers alone tell a story of devastation so immense that even memory cannot soften it. By the final years of World War II, the statistics behind the Browning .30 caliber had become a language of inevitability, a set of figures that shattered illusions of German superiority. Consider this: over 500,000. Browning machine guns were produced by the United States during the war. Every division carried dozens. Each platoon relied on them. And every front, from Pacific jungles to European hedgerows, echoed with their rhythm. Ammunition production was even more staggering. In 1944 alone, factories turned out billions of .30 caliber rounds, so many that logistics officers joked their real battle was keeping up with the endless tide of belts and crates. For German soldiers, who had once believed in the myth of the Reich's unstoppable arsenal, these numbers were unthinkable. Their vaunted MG-42s could fire faster. Yes, but they were fewer. Replacement parts ran scarce, barrels burned out without spares to replace them, and supply lines buckled under Allied bombing. The Americans, by contrast, never seemed to run out. In one battle report from France, a German officer noted bitterly that the enemy fired as if ammunition fell from the sky. Behind the statistics were lives, Crews learned to replace barrels in seconds, to swap tripods in mud, to keep the fire flowing without pause. Infantrymen trusted the Browning the way sailors trust a compass, not flashy, not delicate, but steady and true. And each time German units attacked, the numbers became flesh volleys of rounds that cut through formations, waves of fire that chewed into morale as surely as into bodies. There were also quiet symbols hidden in the figures. A single Browning crew at Bastogne fired 60,000 rounds in a week, holding the line through snow and smoke in the Pacific. Marines on Iwo Jima kept a gun alive, even after its water jacket split, urinating into the barrel to cool it when no water remained. These were not just numbers on paper, they were desperate acts that transformed statistics into survival. Prisoners of war, faced with these realities, often admitted their illusions had been broken. One diary, recovered from a camp in Texas, recorded a stunned realization: the Americans fight with factories. We fight with hope. Hope is not enough. And so, the myth of German dominance dissolved not just in gunfire, but in arithmetic. The Reich had gambled on speed, terror, and spectacle. America had gambled on scale, rhythm, and endurance. The numbers revealed who had chosen wisely. The irony was cruel. The Germans had laughed at the old iron pipe, but the old pipe never stopped firing, and in the end, its numbers spoke louder than any laughter ever could. The war ended, but the echoes never did. For countless veterans, the sound of the Browning .30 caliber lingered in memory long after the guns themselves fell silent. It was not just a noise, it was a rhythm that haunted dreams, a metallic heartbeat that could summon sand, snow, or smoke in an instant. German soldiers who survived spoke of it with a mixture of awe and bitterness. One recalled, decades later, how the slow, steady hammer of the weapon seemed to strip away courage itself. It did not stop. You could hide from the bursts of our own guns, but theirs was like rain, always falling. Others admitted that their mockery had died the moment they first faced it in combat. The Browning, once dismissed as primitive, had become a grim symbol of America's endurance among American veterans. The memories were more complex. For some, the Browning was a savior, the anchor of their unit, the gun that cut down enemy charges before they could overrun a position. For others, it was a burden, a weight carried up cliffs and through jungles, a constant reminder that survival depended on steel as much as flesh. Crews spoke of the burns on their hands, the endless belts of ammunition dragged across muddy fields, the aching backs from hauling tripods through hedgerows. Yet in nearly every story, there was respect. Respect for a weapon that never faltered when lives depended on it. Anecdotes trickled into history books and veterans' reunions. One man confessed he still remembered the smell of steam rising from the water jacket, mixed with the stench of cordite. Another swore he could still feel the vibration in his shoulder when he closed his eyes at night. In small-town parades, old soldiers would point at restored Brownings on jeeps and say quietly, "That one saved me." And in Germany, silence often followed the mention of the weapon. Former POWs remembered camp gossip, remembered the initials scratched into ammunition crates, remembered watching American guards cradle the same gun that had shattered their formations. It was not just a machine, it was a reminder of the factories, the abundance, the sheer weight of a society that could outproduce them tenfold. The Browning .30 caliber outlived the war. It served in Korea, in Vietnam, in countless conflicts where its rhythm once again defined the battlefield. But its legacy was not merely technical, it was psychological, symbolic. It stood as proof that endurance can defeat speed, that persistence can silence laughter. The Germans had once scoffed. Decades later, they could still hear it. History often remembers the fastest, the loudest, the most glamorous. Yet, in war, survival rarely belongs to those who dazzle. It belongs to those who endure. The Browning .30 caliber was not beautiful. It did not terrify with its speed. It did not glitter with innovation. Instead, it was steady, stubborn, unyielding, and that was enough to turn the course of battles, and perhaps even the course of the war itself. For the Germans who mocked it, the lesson came at terrible cost. Their laughter echoed in barracks and trenches, but it was silenced by a rhythm they could not escape. For American soldiers, the weapon became a companion heavy to carry, punishing to serve, but faithful when the tide of battle rose too high, and for those in factories back home. The Browning was the link between their sleepless nights and the safety of sons and brothers overseas. Long after the smoke cleared, the memories endured. Old soldiers, sitting in quiet kitchens or gathering at reunions, spoke of the sound more than the statistics. The metallic heartbeat of the .30 caliber lived in their dreams, a reminder of nights when the world itself seemed to hinge on whether a gun would fire one more belt of rounds. Perhaps that is the true legacy of the Browning, not the steel, not the numbers, but the way it imprinted itself on human memory. A whisper in a POW camp, a note tucked into an ammunition crate, a veteran's trembling hand on a parade ground, all fragments of a larger truth. That sometimes the simplest machine becomes more than a weapon. It becomes a symbol of endurance, of resilience, of history itself refusing to be forgotten.